Welcome to this week's edition of the Wednesday webinar with CUFI on Campus. My name is Jessica Marzuko and I direct the CUFI on Campus program. Today we have a really special guest with us who has been with CUFI for, I would say, close to a decade?
Yeah,
maybe?
very nearly, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we have the Senior Director of Policy and Communications with CUFI, Ari Morgenstern, and we're going to sit down and have a really important conversation about how COVID has impacted the rise of anti-Semitism online. So, Ari, let's just jump right in. We have folks watching from all over the country, sometimes from all over the world, and a lot of people may or may not be aware of how the anti-Semitic community has taken advantage of a time during quarantine and a pandemic to twist what's going on in the world to promote their anti-Semitic rhetoric. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on, the timeline. You know, COVID really hit in the US mid-March. And what did this look like at the beginning when we started to see the fact that anti-Semitism wasn't quarantined?
Sure. Well, look, we saw a year-over-year rise in anti-Semitism even before COVID. In fact, back in January of this year, there was a congressional hearing that discussed anti-Semitic rhetoric specifically on social media. And one member of Congress, Representative Yvette Clarke, noted that anti-Semitic rhetoric on the internet can and does inspire actual deadly attacks. That's a direct quote. At the time, Jason Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, talked about how companies like Twitter and Facebook, quote, need to apply the same energy to protecting vulnerable users that they apply to protecting their corporate profits. Very, very powerful words. So even before the COVID coming into our lives, essentially, we're already seeing a massive increase of anti-Semitism online and across the United States. And then almost from the get-go, from the moment COVID started taking over the headlines, we saw this immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction to something terrible in the world is happening. We're going to blame Jewish people. We're going to advance anti-Semitic claims, stereotypes, and really, I mean, let's not beat around the bush, just direct hate speech. And we're going to use whatever the crisis is, and in this case it was this global pandemic, or is this global pandemic. The anti-Semites are going to use that to advance their position, and their position is obviously just Jew hatred. There's no other word for it. And we saw that from the very get-go. Here in the United States, let me give just a couple examples, just starting here at home. Here in the United States.
Let's actually back up a minute. I've heard you mention how there's historic similarities for the Jewish people being blamed for pandemics and plagues. Let's talk a little bit about what you were discussing earlier and share with us.
Perfectly fair. So, you know, they call anti-Semitism the world's oldest hatred for a reason. It has gone on for thousands of years. But specifically, you know, if we look at the parallel between COVID and other pandemics, as far back as 1349, okay, 2,000 Jews were burnt alive in what was called the Strasbourg Valentine's Day Massacre. And they were burnt alive because the Jews across Europe were being blamed for the Black Death, for the plague. So there's a real parallel here. Things got so bad during the plague in terms of anti-Semitism in Europe that there were, and this is just, I can't imagine, I mean, such a tragedy, there were reports of members of the Jewish community committing suicide rather than endure the horrific persecution, I mean, just grotesque violence, because Jews were being blamed for a global pandemic. So you're absolutely right. There is a tragic and horrific historical precedent here. And we saw it during what is perhaps the most well-known global pandemic, and that is the Black Death or the plague.
Well, it's shocking to see that people will utilize something like COVID to put forth hatred for Israel and the Jewish people. It's mind-blowing that they will sink so low to use this to spread hatred. Let's go back to what you were just about to start talking about and what that has looked like here at home in the USA. Let's talk a little.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here in the United States, we like to think of ourselves in a way as immune to some of the uh, perils or pitfalls that many in the rest of the world face. But I assure you, and this doesn't really just apply to anti-Semitism, we are not. We are a country made up of human beings, made up of citizens, and we are not immune to the hatred being spread even in our own society that puts such an emphasis on the inherent value of human life and in the inherent importance of civil and human rights for all people. So let me just give you a few examples. I'm going to go back to the beginning again, to the beginning of COVID. Early on, we saw extremist groups, including neo-Nazis and other white supremacists, were encouraging their members to spread COVID-19 to police officers and to Jews. This is according to the FBI. We saw one white supremacist, Timothy Wilson, plan to bomb a Missouri hospital where coronavirus patients were being cared for. He was killed in a shootout with the FBI. So we see this convergence of people with a bigoted, hateful ideology seeking to commit acts of violence in the context of COVID. We also saw synagogues in at least a few states, Maryland, Massachusetts, Alabama, it wasn't in one region or anything like that, that were defaced with anti-Semitic slurs and swastikas, again, very early on in the COVID pandemic's rise. And then the convergence almost became complete, if you will, when we started seeing anti-social distancing protesters espousing hateful anti-Semitic rhetoric. For example, one protester in Cleveland held a sign up with a rat and a Star of David and the line beneath it saying, "The real plague." So even here at home in America, where we try to aspire to a truly free and tolerant society, anti-Semitism has infected elements of our neighborhoods, our communities, our country, and we have to do something to combat it.
It's not just in the US. Let's talk a little bit about worldwide. Let's go visit Europe, visit sections of the world where we're seeing an uptick in anti-Semitism during COVID and on social media.
Sure. I mentioned just a second ago about this anti-social distancing protester in Cleveland. Well, I believe it was yesterday, there was an anti-social distancing protest in Germany that included neo-Nazi groups. We've seen before where neo-Nazis join other rallies, and I'm not going to comment on of course, how I view those other rallies, but we've seen neo-Nazis rally and participate in other rallies to try to mainstream their ideology. And early on in COVID in Germany, sticking with Germany for a second, we saw Nazi-inspired graffiti in a German town on Holocaust Remembrance Day. But this is not, just an American and German problem. In France, the head of a party list, in those, parliamentary systems, you have a party list, and the head of that party list of a far-right national political party posted a video on social media trying to link Jews to the spread of coronavirus. In Iran, the semi-official news entity broadcast a number of claims that Zionists, quote, Zionists, were behind the coronavirus. A cleric in Iran declared that one shouldn't listen to the World Health Organization, to their directives about coronavirus, because, quote, they're a bunch of infidels and Jews over at the WHO. In Spain, on the far left, we saw a Basque language website claim that COVID-19, or blame that COVID-19 on, quote, Yankee Zionist imperialism. In Switzerland, we saw one individual note that this is an infamous far-right leader. No, there's a worse virus than the coronavirus, the Judeo-virus, Jewish.
Wow.
So this is not, there's not anyone we saw, when we saw anti-Semitic related rhetoric in Venezuela, we saw it in the Middle East, we saw it in Europe, obviously in North America. So this is not limited to any one continent, any one country. This is a worldwide problem where the coronavirus, just as happened in Europe during the Black Death, is being tied and blamed on Jews and is being tied to this anti-Semitic rhetoric. Anti-Semites never miss an opportunity to blame something bad on the Jewish people. They see it, I believe, as an opportunity to advance their anti-Semitic worldview. I don't actually believe that all of the people that I've just, all of these entities or individuals really believe that the Jewish people are responsible for the coronavirus. But truth obviously doesn't matter to the bigot. And they see this as an opportunity to prey on people's fears in order to advance their claims and their rhetoric and then spew their hate speech. And they'll continue to do so unless effectively and appropriately confronted by everyone from the social media companies, these large gargantuan entities, to you and I and every other individual of conscience who cares and believes that not to speak, to borrow a quote, of course, is to speak, and that we cannot be silent in the face of this rhetoric.
Let's talk a little bit about social media. You opened with a quote from a rep from the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, that anti-Semitic rhetoric on the internet can and does inspire actual deadly attacks. Right now, we are seeing a surge, an uptick, whatever you want to call it, in anti-Semitic comments on the internet, and sometimes from people with extremely high profile people with audiences in the tens of millions. Let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing and what the general gist of what they're saying is.
Sure. Well, just earlier this week, I saw CNN headline from a few days ago, and I'm going to quote it. Coronavirus lockdowns are fueling an explosion of anti-Semitism online. Now, this was referencing specifically the United Kingdom, because you had and I think part of it was inspired, or the angle of the story, I should say, came to fruition because you had a popular rapper in the UK tweet some anti-Semitic hate speech, and Twitter was predictably slow, is the way I'll put it, to respond. Again, this is not a problem restricted to the United Kingdom, of course. We've seen celebrities and athletes and such here in the US post anti-Semitic rhetoric and post items that are deeply painful, deeply hurtful to an entire group of people. And I use this phrase a lot, not just to Jewish people, but to any person of conscience. If you see racism and it's not directed at you, or you see bigotry and it's not directed at your particular background, it should still hurt you, still affect you. And I believe that for the vast majority of people, it does. Now, in some of these cases, and I want to offer a little delineation here. In some of the cases, I think that you are seeing people manipulated, people who don't really know the issue perhaps as well. I don't blame them for that. They don't have to be neck deep in all of what we're discussing today. Maybe people that are a little bit younger, you're seeing them taken advantage of, led astray perhaps by others. And in most of these cases, in the cases of some of these athletes and celebrities, once they realized that the language that they used was hurtful and painful, they made apologies. And I think that I will speak for myself. I believe that if you make a mistake, there's some grace should be extended if you are willing to own up to it and apologize. In one particular case, and I'm not going to name names because I don't think it's necessary. In one particular case, somebody tweeted something that was rather offensive to Jews. And some people reached out to him, and he is seeking to learn. And obviously, I wish for his sake, for all of our sakes, that the post had never been made. But he's seeking to learn more about the issue. And that is the mark of character, is being able to admit when you've made a mistake, apologize for it, and learn from it, and reach out to the kind of people who might be able to offer you better guidance than whatever guidance you received that led you down that dark path. Because we can all be led down, especially if we're ignorant of certain cultural sensitivities, or unaware, I shouldn't say ignorant, unaware of them. We can all be led astray, and it's important to extend a little grace to those who really show character and strength of character, admit and apologize for their errors. But there's a flip side of this equation. There are people, celebrities, others, for whom anti-Semitism is a part of their worldview. It's a defining characteristic of how they see the world, how they see, politics, how they see any number of issues. It might even be a defining characteristic in what they would call their faith, which is, of course, deeply appalling to anyone who is a person of faith, regardless of how you worship God. And those individuals need to be, I believe, forcefully confronted. If you make a mistake, we should show love and forgiveness. If you are someone who is guiding others to hatred, we should confront you. And we've seen both of those kind of series of events transpire here in recent weeks. And part of it is because, coming back to COVID, because COVID has enabled the Pied Pipers of hate to spread their message more effectively. And social media, with all the wonderful things that social media and the internet have brought us, social media has given those hate preachers, is what we'll call them, a much larger platform. They're reaching people they might not have otherwise reached under any circumstances. So we have to recognize the new reality. We have to always conduct ourselves in the manner in which we'd want to be treated, right? And then we have to confront those who are doubling down on this bigotry, this hatred.
And I just want to echo and reinforce what you're sharing right now, Ari, that sometimes people do speak it out against Israel and the Jewish people in anti-Semitic ways from ignorance and the fact they do not understand what the underlying issues are and what they've been told and asked to repeat. And that is something that we do with CUFI on campus, is we try to educate folks with a narrative that they may have heard is anti-Semitic and they're unaware. And I agree, it shows an incredible amount of character for someone who has a platform of millions of people who, after they had said something extremely hateful about Israel in ignorance, they weren't fully aware of what was going on beneath the surface. For them to come out and apologize publicly, I applaud that. And I think that those folks are going to be friends for years to come. And if they're open to re-examining their beliefs and they do make a public apology like that, I know we in CUFI on campus, we applaud that. And when we work on campuses with students, we see this all the time. People come up to us while we're tabling and they will say just sound bites of hate. And we have a conversation and we educate folks. And the folks who come back toward the truth and the true narrative of who Israel and the Jewish people are, they're the ones who are going to be lifelong friends if they've overcome something that was incredibly in error. So when we're seeing the people that are apologizing and they're showing their followers and the people who look up to them, hey, it's okay to say you were wrong. It's okay to now move in the right direction. And people who are pro-Israel, we have to be educating. We cannot just be attacking people who have already apologized. Doubling down on the people, like I said, who are digging in with their anti-Semitic tropes, that is our job as well.
if I could digress for just one moment, when I was a kid, personal story, but I think it really speaks to this. When I was a kid, long time ago, I remember that our synagogue had swastikas spray painted on it, and there was somebody in the community uh, where we lived who was basically an avowed supporter of the Ku Klux Klan, and he confronted our rabbi, and the rabbi didn't respond with hate. Um, he explained to the person what they were really, what their actions, and I'm not saying this is the person who spray painted the swastikas. I don't believe that was ever proven or anything of that nature. But he kind of explained to him some of the history. The rabbi took the time to extend a hand, and those two men became real friends. And this was when I was a little kid. I was probably 8, 9 years old, but I remember the story because it shows you that should you confront bigotry and call it out? Absolutely, every time. But the antidote to hate is love. And the antidote to this darkness is light. And I'm not saying every bigot, I live in the deep South. I certainly understand the horrific history of, in particular, the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not saying that's going to work every time, but even if it works 1% of the time, that's one less person who's going to go out and spread that hate. And that's one more person who doesn't have to live with that hatred in their hearts, which I can't imagine how much of a challenge and how difficult that is for a human being to just be so angry and so hateful all the time. So there are these spots, there are these moments, there are individuals who, even though they've embraced it, can be gently led back to a good place. If they refuse the hand, then we must confront them. But especially in the case of some of the celebrities and athletes that we've seen recently, I really believe that a hand was extended to them, not with a bunch of fanfare, not with a bunch of publicity, but it was extended to them, and they took it, and that shows that deep down they're good people, and we have the power and the ability to fight this, not just in a battle-like scenario, but also with the very basic principles of love and forgiveness that define the Judeo-Christian existence.
It's so good. It's so good. And circle back to what you were saying on how often do we confront anti-Semitism. You shared a personal story. I'll share one from last week. I was on a Zoom with members of the Jewish community. There were about 8 of us on this call, and they were discussing recent anti-Semitic incidences at campuses and online. And there was a conversation on, when do we start calling this out, because it's continuous and it's wearisome and it's constant. How often do we call out anti-Semitism? And I was astonished to hear this conversation, because it can get so fatiguing for the Jewish community to constantly have to defend their right to exist and to call out the demonization, the delegitimization. And it broke my heart, and it made me think about, 1930s Europe. Maybe the same conversation was happening. How often do we call this out? When do we speak up? When is it appropriate? And it's every single time.
That's right.
And with, Kufi, we're growing to 9 million members soon. We're well into the 8 million members. And that's exactly who we are as Kufi. We're to stand alongside the Jewish people, for the first time in history, the church coming alongside and saying, not on our watch, this isn't going to happen. And just to do a throwback to a Bible story, Aaron holding up the arms of Moses, we're to come alongside and help the Jewish people in this constant attack of anti-Semitism across the world, and now really taking place in an incredible degree on social media. So let's talk about what we can do, what we are doing, some things that are taking place on Twitter, for instance, that we just took part in as CUFI. Let's talk about what we can do.
Sure. So what you referenced a moment ago is after that rapper that I referenced earlier in the United Kingdom, uh, after Twitter was slow to react, the Jewish community in the UK and it traveled over to the United States, and it extended beyond the Jewish community to organizations like CUFI and individuals all over the country. We participated in a 48-hour walkout of Twitter. No space for Jew hatred on Twitter was the hashtag. We posted it, and we didn't post anything for 48 hours because sometimes, and this generated media attention and so forth, and I hope that it sent a message to the leadership of Twitter that they need to deal with the fact that their platform is being used to advance hate speech, and that their standards here are not up to par. There was a hearing in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, very recently, past week and a half, where a Twitter representative bent over backwards to explain why the genocidal rhetoric of Iran's Ayatollah was not taken off Twitter, but certain politicians in the United States and certain conservative or viewpoints in the U.S. Are flagged. And this inability, and for a moment, let me say, I don't mean to just pick on Twitter. Okay, the social media platforms as a whole have a problem here. Okay, TikTok refused to even participate in the hearing that I'm talking about, and YouTube flagged and took down a video that CUFI posted featuring Irving Roth, a Holocaust survivor, who I'm sure many of your students are familiar with, and flagged what Irving said as hate speech. So we're living in a world where the Ayatollah could basically call for genocide of the Jewish people in Israel, and that's okay. But YouTube is flagging, taking down a Holocaust survivor's message. So this is a dramatic problem. And I don't believe in this concept of a corporate entity is a nameless, faceless anything. They're made up of individuals, of human beings who should think on a moral level and who should be people of conscience, be the people that they want to be, that they would aspire to be. And in order to do that, they have to take responsibility for how their tool is being used, not just to advance hate speech, but as we noted before, as that Congresswoman said during the hearing, because this hate speech often turns to violence, which is the logical conclusion of bigotry. It's not people who hate so deeply that they would spout off about it. A percentage of them are not going to be content just yelling. They're going to start acting. And we already know this to be true. So there seems to be amongst the social media companies, there's a problem overall in terms of bigotry being advanced on these platforms, but there seems to be almost a higher tolerance by the social media companies in the context of efforts to deal with bigotry, a higher tolerance for anti-Semitic rhetoric. And I find that truly appalling. And we're seeing some of that in the convergence of old world anti-Semitism and the COVID pandemic. So you said a moment ago, what can we do about it, right? So there's this old saying, if you see something, say something. Your voice has real power. Flag content on social media platforms that you believe is hate speech. Let them know, because if enough of us do it, even if they only view us as consumers, which I don't want to believe that that's the way our social media companies view the world, but even if they only view us that way, if enough consumers aren't happy about something, they'll react. Remember that, you're a consumer, you're a voter, you're a voice. Use your voice to let the world know that there's no place for hate, be it online or anywhere else. So I mentioned the 48-hour walkout that we engaged in. There are other items. CUFI has worked and successfully saw the president sign an executive order where the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism was applied for Title VI, which deals with the Department of Education, deals with the harassment that many of our students face on campus because they stand with Israel, right? So there's policy items that we've dealt with. We helped advance and saw signed into law the Never Again Education Act, because at the core of this, bigotry is often rooted in ignorance. So if we teach you, ensure that, the younger generation, those folks in, middle and high school, learn about the Holocaust, learn about the dangers of anti-Semitism, then that inoculates them against some of those, Pied Pipers of hatred that I mentioned earlier, those who would lead people astray in that manner. In Proverbs, it says that the power of life and death is in the tongue. And we've seen that to be true. Tragically, we've seen that to be true. But I mentioned earlier, kind of the guiding principles of Judeo-Christian civilization, of Western civilization. Every human being, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or how they worship God, every human being has an inherent value. That's a very basic foundational standard, that whether you're an individual who gets on social media once every 6 months, whether you work in a factory or you're a doctor or you're, someone, working in a restaurant, whatever it is, wherever you come from, whatever you do in life, I think that basic value should be a part of who you are. And that also includes companies and the leaders of these giant social media companies. Because I believe that if you ask them if they themselves are anti-Semitic, they'd say no, of course. If they themselves hold any bigoted views, they would say no, of course. But if their platform is being used to advance that, they need to do something about it if they're to live up to this ideal. If I owned a billboard company, I wouldn't let someone put hateful messages on the billboard.
Good.
I just wouldn't do it. I don't care how much you pay me. What is social media if not an internet version of that same concept? So your first priority as a citizen, as a consumer, as a voter, is to make sure your voice is heard. I love the campaign that CUFI on Campus does, where they talk about raising their voice. Raise your voice for the persecuted Christian in the Middle East. And we need to raise our voice whenever we see hate. And in this context, we need to raise our voice on social media, because that's where it's happening right now. It's happening in part because people aren't going out as much. So they're at home on their computers, so that's where they're spewing their hatred. And we need to raise our voice for that. And I believe we can have a tangible impact.
So good. And I know with what we teach our students in CUFI on Campus is to make your voice heard, exactly like you're saying. The individual voice matters. So much of getting the truth out there about what's going on with anti-Semitism and how everything seems to be exploited to continue the conversation about anti-Semitism, even COVID. I mean, who knew? So raising your voice, making your voice heard. CUFI is moving forward with a film,
That's right.
really powerful film to be released this fall. Let's share with our viewers a little bit about that film and the impact that it can potentially have if they come on board and get it out there.
Sure. Well, no spoilers, but the film is, I've watched a lot of films about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, documentaries and such. And this is a full-length featured film, a documentary. The two individuals, the two protagonists of the film are Qasim Hafiz, who is our Middle East analyst, and I'm sure many of the CUFI campus folks are familiar with him. And of course, Irving Roth, a Holocaust survivor and educator, whose voice is it's vital. And you watch the journey in this film that these two individuals take, and you go down, you travel with them down their dark path. as they describe, in Irving's case, what he endured, in Kasim's case, what he believed. And then you walk with them as they come back into the light. And the value of such a film that's so different from anything I've ever seen in this context before really can't be overstated. So the film is going to be debuting for 2 nights in October. Obviously, our CUFI campus and our entire CUFI family folks will be made aware of the specifics, and God willing, where you might be able to view it will also, I'm sure, have ways to view it online. But it's a film that covers a topic that's been researched heavily and discussed a great deal, yet it manages to be unique. And not just because I know Irving and Kasim, perhaps more so if you don't know their story and you don't know them personally. The journeys that you go on with them are so deeply moving and bring the message home in such a way that I really have never seen anything quite like it. And of course, it also, you know, you hear from experts and you hear from dignitaries and you hear from, you know, elder statesmen and women, and those messages really bring it all together. But for me, the power of this film and the uniqueness of it is in the story of Irving and Kasim as human beings. And that's what we have to recall in this entire discussion. And it's a good way to kind of bring it to a close in a way, is that what the bigots forget is our shared humanity. I don't care if you're a Republican, I don't care if you're a Democrat or independent. I don't care if you pray to God in Hebrew, English, Arabic, or French. We are all human beings. And to see the shared humanity displayed by Irving and Kasim is a thing of beauty. And the filmmakers really did an amazing job making that happen. And I encourage you all to watch it.
And I can't wait till it comes out. I know just Irving's story is so powerful right now, with people denying that the Holocaust ever took place.
Yeah.
And just having traveled with this 90-year-old gentleman as he speaks to thousands of students across the nation about his story, his experience in Auschwitz, the fact that he never saw his grandparents again once they, you know, rolled in on the train tracks to a concentration camp. This is not that long ago. Irving is here and he's a witness, and this movie is going to be incredibly powerful. We encourage you all to show up in droves to the theaters to make sure that this incredible story is heard. I know Irving, after he spoke to a university in Utah, we're waiting at this tiny little airport, and on the news screen in the corner of the waiting room before we boarded a tiny little puddle jumper plane, it was a story about the knifing intifada going on in Israel, where terrorists were stabbing everyday citizens in Israel simply because they were Jewish. And I'll never forget, he looked up at the screen, and, you know, at that point he was pushing 90, and he said, "I don't stop because they don't stop."
Mm.
And as long as there are anti-Semites, as long as there are people calling for the destruction of Israel, as long as there are people making sweeping statements blaming Israel and the Jewish people for something like a pandemic or the Black Plague in the 1300s, we need to be speaking out and saying we will not stop because they don't stop. So I encourage everyone, all the students watching this, contact your regional field coordinator. We have some really powerful campaigns for you to share on social media, to make your voice heard, to speak out against the anti-Semitism that is spiking online right now. And we'll walk you through all of the process of these campaigns to make your voice heard. And Ari, I want to thank you so much for spending time. I really think that this interview was enlightening for a lot of people on what's going on and what's at stake and how words do matter. So we will see you again next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time for another Wednesday webinar. And again, thank you, Ari, and I hope to have you back. Will you join us on another topic?
I love doing this stuff with CUFI on campus. I think the work that the students do is absolutely vital. The battles you fight are the battles we fight. And I am always humbled by the incredible passion and courage that the Kufine campus team and students display. So I will come back anytime.
Awesome. You're one of our most requested speakers, so you will be getting invited back. So thank you again, and we'll see you all back here at 8 Eastern Time for our next Wednesday webinar. Thank you for joining us.
All right, I'm going to stop recording.